My Lords, first oral question, Baroness Bennett of Manor Castle.
My Lords, I beg leave to ask the question standing under my name on the order paper.
My Lords, following the committee's report, the Government commissioned research on the prevalence and nature of sex work. This did not lend itself to clear recommendations on a new approach. We continue to engage with the police and others with a focus on reducing the harm that can be associated with prostitution. We know there are links between brothels and organised criminal gangs and have no plans to amend the legislation in this area.
I thank the Noble Lord the Minister for his answer, and I note that the Independent reported in December that the National Police Chief Lead on prostitution and sex work said he was working alongside the government to reassess particularly the brothel keeping legislation. His words were, quote, "I don't think that it is helpful," close quotes. Now, this occurs in the context, of course, of the cost of living crisis. And to quote a sex worker from Leeds, she said, "We're in the middle of a cost of living crisis, and although sex work is legal, there aren't any regulations and safe places for people to work legally, and the wages haven't gone up at all. Survivalist sex work is a massive issue." Close quotes. In December, the talk was of action. If you'll let me. The talk was in December of action. Is the government going to urgently relook at this question in light particularly of the cost of living crisis?
The Noble Lady is quite right. The DCC and the Safeguarding Minister had an introductory conversation at the end of January at which they discussed all of those issues. The Safeguarding Minister highlighted that the government was not minded at present to seek to change the law, based partly on, I'm afraid, a lack of unequivocal evidence. On the subject of the cost of living crisis, we're obviously extremely concerned to hear of women who feel that they have no other choice but to turn to survival sex, and we're committed to ensuring that no one finds themselves in this position.
Response is just inadequate given the situation. He says that he accepts that there are major problems, but he's doing nothing about it. When will he actually come forward with a plan to deal with this problem?
Well, my Lords, after the committee's report, we did commission some research by the University of Bristol in association with the Police and Crime Commissioner for South Wales. I'm afraid that report did not deliver any unequivocal evidence, as I've just said. And also the evidence from other jurisdictions where a different approach is tried is also unequivocal. So for the moment, things are going to stay the way they are.
My Lords, I'm looking forward to the day when sex workers pay their fair share of tax, unlike some, I might mention. Those tax revenues would be more secure if they could work safely with simple, practical measures, like two sex workers working together without risk of prosecution for pimping each other out. Seriously. Successive governments have turned deaf ears to the plight of sex workers, while the men who exploit them and abuse them get away scot-free. Is there any chance that this government will behave any differently?
My Lords, the National Police Chief Council updated guidance in 2019, and it's important to note that that guidance prioritises safety over enforcement action in terms of the criminalisation of these practices. It is incredibly important that this guidance is followed because it advises forces to focus on how to make those involved in sex work safe and to conduct risk assessments before enforcing brothel keeping legislation. As to tax, I'm not going to comment.
I'm looking forward to the day when we actually don't have sex workers. And what is the government's attitude towards working towards getting rid of the reason why people are driven into sex work, which is nearly always the slavery of poverty?
Well, my Lords, I mean, it's fair to say it is, I think, the oldest profession, so I suspect we'll never entirely get rid of it, which is regrettable, of course. But in terms of poverty, I think our strategy in terms of all of the things that are being done at the moment to alleviate that are fairly clear.
Bishop. 25 years ago, I co-chaired, as government co-chair, of the Women's National Commission, in which over 100 women's organisations were represented. This, as I'm sure my noble friend knows, is not a new problem, whatever the state of the economy. And among that, over 100 women's organisations was everything from Army Wives to the English Collective of Prostitutes. So I feel I have a little insight into some of their problems. And I would say to my noble friend, I think one of the biggest difficulties for any government wanting to make changes here, and I do support such changes, is actually finding the right premises. To put it bluntly, nobody wants one next door. And I think if my noble friend is really serious about this, the government should address that problem in order to make some progress.
Well, my noble friend is quite right, of course, but also this is an evolving problem. There are a number of practices now that take place that wouldn't have happened when my noble friend was involved in this subject herself, including, of course, online activities and so on and so forth. Again, as to housing, I don't think it's for me to comment, but of course I understand where she's coming from on that subject.
Services in the UK are now facilitated and advertised and negotiated online. And these websites have been identified as a space where offenders and human traffickers can coerce and force individuals into selling sexual services. Is the government taking any action on the role that adult websites are playing in human trafficking and sexual exploitation?
Well, my noble friend is right to bring up the subject of adult services websites, and because of course we recognise that criminals do and can use prostitution and sex work to target and exploit vulnerable people for their own commercial gain. Adult services websites are the most significant enabler of sexual exploitation linked to trafficking. So we are developing a cross-agency adult services websites approach. We're investing additional resources to support the police. But also, and I think it's important to come back to an earlier question, we are tackling demand by targeting users of adult services websites to raise awareness of sexual exploitation on these sites through the use of things like Google Ads.
Carrying on from the last question, the police on one occasion took me around North London for an evening, and as we were leaving, they pointed out a considerable number of brothels in the Tottenham area in which they said they were almost all trafficked women. This is a very serious matter, and if there are to be premises for people, women, to work, and sometimes for men to work, bear in mind that a great many of them are trafficked.
Well, I think the noble and lady is absolutely right, and that's something we do need to be aware of. Again, a lot of this comes, I think, down to reducing demand for sexual services, and I think it's worth pointing out that the improved guidance has highlighted that Section 53A of the Sexual Offences Act makes it illegal to pay for the sexual services of a prostitute subjected to force, threats or any other form of coercion or deception. And that is a strict liability offence, meaning it is not a valid defence that the defendant did not know that the prostitute had been subject to force or coercion. That should probably be more widely known.
My Lords, the government has already mentioned, the Minister has already mentioned, the government's own report from the University of Bristol in 2019, which said, and I quote, "A substantial proportion of women engaging in sex work did so for financial reasons, a decision often influenced by caring responsibilities, a lack of access to benefits and support services and health services." From the Minister's response that we've had here this afternoon, it's clear that since 2019 the government hasn't done anything. Or has it? And if so, could he tell us what it is?
As I tried to explain earlier, I think that part of the problem is that the gathering of evidence to support any particular course of action is proving very, very difficult. The 2019 review that was conducted by the University of Bristol had as one of its remits the strengthening the evidence base, which was one of the select committee's recommendations. But the nature of prostitution makes it very difficult to accurately estimate the prevalence, and the research was unable to identify a single estimate. The nature of this work is evolving and changes completely, and has done over time.
Noble Lord, the Minister will be aware of other models internationally, from full decriminalisation in New Zealand to the sex purchase law in Sweden. What assessment has government made of their applicability or otherwise in the UK?
The noble lady will be aware as well that there's a different legislative approach across the United Kingdom, including in Northern Ireland, where all buying of sex has been criminalised and the selling decriminalised. But I'm afraid, I go back to an earlier point I was made, we've yet to see unequivocal evidence that any one approach is better at tackling harm and exploitation, and that remains our priority. So we're going to continue to monitor the implementation and impact of the changes in Northern Ireland, but as yet, not sufficient evidence.
By a woman for sexual purposes is illegal. Has any progress been made on criminalising the men who actually approach the women who are also soliciting?
Of course, there are some offences associated with that already, in particular things like curb crawling.
No doubt the Minister is aware that the majority of women who are trafficked are trafficked into the sex trade. He has made reference to the Northern Ireland position, of which I have steered a private member's bill through the Northern Ireland Assembly on this very subject. Would he be prepared to consider what is happening in Northern Ireland, and which endeavours to give much more, if not complete, protection to women who are trafficked into the sex trade?
Well, as I intimated earlier, we're going to continue to monitor the situation in Northern Ireland very closely, as well as, of course, the other international models, such as the Nordic and New Zealand models. So that work will not stop.
Question, the Lord Bishop of Glasgow.